Hi, and welcome to another episode of Production Value Matters, the business events podcast. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Dani Daubaras, the head of field and events at Traba, a distinguished professional in the realm of global event management and strategic communications. Dani brings over a decade of rich experience in crafting unforgettable events that not only promote brands, but also foster deep connections among participants. Starting her career managing high stakes events at venues like the Ritz-Carlton and evolving into roles at powerhouse companies like TomTom and Booking.com, Dani has honed a unique ability to blend marketing strategy with audience engagement to create impactful experiences. So her current role at Traba involves optimizing global supply chain interactions through carefully curated events, demonstrating her versatility and commitment to excellence in every aspect of her work. Dani, it is really fantastic to have you on the show today. How are you?
Thanks, Matthew, and thank you for the introduction. I should have you write just all of my little summaries. It makes me sound so wonderful. I really appreciate that. I'm doing very well. I appreciate you inviting me onto this podcast, and might I say congratulations to you as well, because I saw yesterday you celebrated 5 years
We
with the
did, yeah.
company. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
we survived.
amazing. Yes, that's incredible. That's a great milestone. So
Thank you.
congratulations to you.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Denny, with a decade of global event management and communications, you've made some significant impact in the industry. What initially drew you to the to event marketing, and what continues to fuel your passion for creating those kind of experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it kind of stems from a history of bringing people together. Even from a very young age, I very much enjoyed kind of bringing together groups, energy, people around me, creating atmospheres. And that was something I dabbled in starting there at the Ritz, also working in hospitality a little bit earlier when I was like a teenager into my college life as well. I studied marketing in college, so it was a related field, but I didn't necessarily study marketing thinking I would go into event marketing. I just kind of thought, well, marketing's for people who like to talk a lot, who like to network, the basic things. What do I want to do? And I went into marketing. I have to say that I've learned more about event marketing while I was at the Ritz and also while I joined a hospital foundation in my late teens, early 20s, working as like an event manager, kind of facilitator, coordinator, marketeer, kind of all around. I worked with one woman individually who was running the foundation, and she was responsible for creating the events, gaining sponsors, donations, where all the proceeds went to a specific unit at the hospital. And that was really kind of my first taste of event marketing from like a corporate perspective. Whereas at the Ritz, it was more, we have this event we're going to do. I didn't book those events, but I would execute a lot of them, or I would manage the production of them, or do private wine tastings, or poker nights, or weddings, but more on the operations side, less on the production side. So early on in my career, that's kind of how it started. And it wasn't until, well, I guess maybe 1, 2 years into booking, I realized it could be an entire career. I was like, I did not like understand that that was a possible path for me. But once I did, I thought, yeah, well, I can do this full time. Like, and what a great job to have. Of course, I was also naive to the amount of work it takes. Not to say that I didn't like to work hard, but like I did not understand how detailed it really gets when you start doing large scale events. And I just grew deeper into appreciation for it as I got into it more. So that's kind of, I guess, my why. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing that I think everybody comes to the industry in one or three or four ways, from either hospitality or production or sometimes through marketing and other ways. But that common thread of when I got into it, I didn't realize how much work it was, and some people like thrive on that, and some people get very surprised at that. So I'm glad that was the thing that made you thrive. Um,
Exactly.
yeah. So reflecting on your career in event marketing, would you share something that you consider one of your proudest achievements, and what particularly stands out to you for that success?
Yeah, great question. I mean, there were a lot of events we did at Booking that I was really proud to be a part of. In general, the Booking.com team has probably still, but certainly when I was there, an incredibly high performing culture. And I kind of stumbled into that job unexpectedly in the best way possible. And I just ended up in the right place at the right time. But I think there was one year in particular, right before COVID hit, was actually executing the event in early 2020 that we kind of changed some of the way we did our annual events that year, and we ended up producing a lot of like mini events, not so small, like they were, let's say, ranging from 500 to roughly 3,000 people, depending on what site we were visiting, but across a bunch of different countries. And my team, three people on my team, and we were responsible for 17 of those events in 17 different countries with execution taking place across 3 weeks. It was also changed quite last minute, if I recall correctly. End of 2019, we found out like October or November, we're going to be producing these events in end of Jan, early February. It was a huge project. And that was the first time I had a really small team, and we kind of went the full process of the event production from really complete scratch to end day of event and everything in between, but at 17 different venues in 17 different countries that spoke different languages and had all these nuances for a global audience. It was a really big challenge, very successful, very rewarding events. But that's probably one of the time frames in my life I'm the most proud of in terms of my career when it comes to at least the production side of it. Yeah, really memorable, a lot of work, a lot of hands involved. Great. I had great team, so that's fantastic. But yeah, that's one that sticks out for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And so now you've taken on the role of head of field and events at Trava. What are you focusing on in these early days?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I joined Traba back in May. Was very exciting for me to join because this company is a really fast-paced rocket ship type of startup that's going to take off. It's going to be incredibly successful. Already is doing really well. I have a lot of belief in the company, and that excites me. The energy in the office is very vibrant. What I kind of realized pretty quickly, I was hired as the head of field and events to basically do our events. You know, what are we attending? What do we want to produce? Try to help support our growing sales cycle, things like that. But it was evident pretty early on that we needed to take even a step back and ask ourselves, what is our brand? What is our wider marketing strategy? Which content and communication and identity is then conveyed at an event? How do we want to show up to these events? So I ended up kind of taking a step back. We're still going to events, we're still attending them, we're still having events in our office and things like that. We have plans to have bigger ones in the future produced by us, of some sponsorships, things like that. But actually, I'd say more of the work I've done has been on kind of general marketing, w really outlining that foundation so that when we go to sponsorships and when we produce our own events that are maybe with some strategic partners or influential industry leaders, how we're showing up is consistent. We have our messaging kind of aligned. We know our general direction from a marketing perspective to utilize and leverage during those events. So that's where we are today. There's a lot that will happen as we move forward. Have you ever been part of a startup? I'm sure you have. You have this company, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like we're constantly in startup mode for the last 5 years,
Constantly.
you know? Uh,
Exactly.
yeah, I think in that post that you mentioned, I sort of said, hey, look, a pandemic wasn't on our business plan, right? So, it was a startup for a couple of months, and then we suddenly turned into another startup that was trying to like redefine some what we were doing in the industry, and then coming out of it and the changes that like so I feel like the whole industry has been in a startup mode for years, and certainly we feel that way. But to specifically to your question, no, like we've serviced startups for their events, but I have never I have a creative director friend who almost exclusively works in that startup field. Like he
Yeah.
gets a job as their head of events, and the stories he tells me are harrowing to say the least.
Yeah, yeah, it's busy. You learn more. I've never worked at a startup. I've always worked for mature organizations, but you learn so much more so quickly because there's nobody there to teach it to you. So you kind of got to figure it out yourself, and it really takes a specific type of individual and mindset, a collective group of people working in that company to have that proactive approach, have that perseverance because it's not all perfect. You can't, I had so many resources at my previous company. I had internal agencies, best vendors that are in the area, great connections. And it's not to say that I don't have those things now, but it's a totally different industry that I'm in. I came from tech, but I came from also travel. I have some fitness related background, mapping, but the light industrial industry is completely different. So there's a lot to learn, but that's part of the excitement of it, and that's part of why it's so enticing for professionals similar to where I am today to kind of take that risk in their career and see really what they're made of when they stand out on their own. So that in 10, 15 years from now, maybe I'm taking a different step, maybe I'm doing something else, but I have such a great growing experience to learn from. Yeah. So more to come on Trava.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm kind of interested in going off script for a couple of seconds and just
Yeah.
sort of asking about that transition from sort of, as you said, a more mature organization into that startup world. And I would feel instinctually that has some disadvantages. As you said, you lose sort of maybe that larger mature organization support structure and that historical business relationships within the market, all of those kind of things. But you would also, that might actually be an advantage where do you find going from one world to the next that you're not restricted by, say, if like a massive procurement process or a scoring system or anything like that, and you are able to build those dynamic relationships a little bit better in a startup world than you would, say, working for XYZ financial institution.
Absolutely. I mean, you're spot on, Matthew. It's a very difficult transition, perhaps more mentally than it is anything else. There's a lot of different nuances with startups that I've learned so far than with mature organizations. Of course, the structure, the kind of the hoops you jump through when you need to get approval on certain concepts or ideas that you want to roll out or campaigns you want to roll out. You don't have that type of structure at a startup. So you have the autonomy to really go big, go bold, make mistakes, fail fast, learn from them, things like that. At the same time, you have much tighter budgets to work with. You really want to show your ROI as much as possible, which can be really difficult, specifically in events when you're building, foundational relationships that are usually more for long-term, larger upmarket type of clients. So there are definitely some disadvantages and advantages. I think some of the benefits I see, at least for Trava, is there's a lot of people in my company. We're less than 100 people that have worked for many startups. And I think they bring a lot of that experience that I lack. I really enjoy working with people who have very diverse experience and who don't have the same strengths as me, so I can learn from them. And then I think I bring some of that structural knowledge. Okay, well, if this is the structure we need to get to, how can we work backwards to get to that structure internally? For example, with events, how can we produce our own event in 1 or 2 years? What does it look like, and where do we need to start? And we've kind of started with more conference attendance, conference sponsorships, some smaller private dinners or private events, depending on kind of what we're after, some recruitment events internally as we grow and prepare for our Series B, things like that. But eventually, it will also turn into larger private events, maybe more strategic events, potentially even events where we're selling tickets, getting speakers on stage, using or leveraging our partnerships that we have in place for events and during events. So there's a lot of possibilities with it, but we need to almost work backwards and try to build kind of the strategy towards that.
I love that you have a growth plan for that. I think
mentally at least.
Well, mentally, yeah, for sure. I don't whether or not you've gotten buy-in from everybody else, that's yeah, I'm sure we could do a whole episode on that. But, I love the idea that you have that sort of vision in place and you're I think a lot of people in the industry sometimes get presented with what's in front of them and try to, uh, for lack of a better way of saying this, they try to deal with it, and get a little stuck in the weeds. I think the expression is, you can't see the forest for the tree you're banging your head on, kind of thing. And it's great that you have that sort of in the back of your mind, and you're thinking about how these growth events sort of tie into a bigger goal. And so, congratulations on that. So, Danny, in the context of sort of creating what we call unforgettable events, how does production value sort of factor into that for you? And how do you balance that sort of spectacle or production value with the subtlety that you need to create experiences that stick with attendees? And, in the context of you're just speaking about the ROI and, getting teams to sort of buy into that, we all understand that we need a sense of production value and sort of finish on the show or on the event. But how are you walking through that process of conceptualization and executing an event with production value and those factors in mind?
Great question, Matthew. Thank you so much. When I think about events that I've been to, whatever that may be, work related, fitness related, music, entertainment, I'm constantly remembering them based on the way that they made me feel. And I think to create an impactful event, you need to really focus on evoking that emotion from your audience. Now, that's more on the side of when you're doing your own production, something you create really from scratch that you are like doing A to Z from. If you're doing conference attendance, that might look a little bit different for a team. That might look more on how can we make human connections at this conference? How can we share our stories and not just work related? Of course, you're at a conference usually to gain brand recognition, to maybe sell a product or a service, or maybe you're looking for a product or a service. But ultimately, you're there to network, really. And those types of connections take time to build, and they're built like you would make any connection. How can you relate to somebody? And people relate through their senses. They're seeing, they're hearing, they're smelling, they're tasting, they're touching, they're listening. How are you coming across? What types of questions are you asking? How are you connecting with them? And usually, if I'm attending a conference, I try to do that by simply getting to know the person that I'm actually speaking with, really listening to them, trying to understand almost what makes them tick. Why are they there? What are they looking for? What do they hope to get out of this event? How does that relate to a broader goal? If you're doing, taking a step back, if you're doing something that's more on the production side, where you're producing the event, you can utilize those kind of five senses throughout your event to try and bring emotion into it so that when people think about, oh, I went to this event with X, Y, and Z, they think, oh, I had so much fun, or oh, that speaker was so cool to listen to, or I felt really inspired by that keynote session. Those are the things they remember. That's what we try to provide. And in terms of ROI to measure that, we can do that with getting people involved from the very start of the event, from a production. Who do you want to see on stage? What do you want the theme to be? All the way to in event qualitative feedback, or maybe an area dedicated to kind of allowing people to share their in event immediate feedback. What do you miss out of this? Or give us an idea for next year. And then, of course, you have like surveys, post-event surveys that you can, write out and take the ROI or the NPS score from. With conferences, it's a little bit different. How many people did you make connections with that potentially have influenced a potential deal or the closing of a deal? What's the ROI on that deal? Does it cover the conference costs? Does it have more of a financial benefit than just what you paid to be at the conference? Or on the other hand, is it an investment for a potentially much larger deal with larger clients that might take 1-2 years to close, but you're laying the groundwork for something like that?
And so so I want to get into sort of some long-term business relationship building and some objectives you get into with your events. But just to wrap up this whole idea of production value, do you think that, infusing that sort of sense of production value in those events is an important way to frame those messages and to boost that ROI? Like, in the absence of production value, do you think your events could suffer?
I think your events can suffer for a multitude of reasons. They could suffer in the absence of it. If you're really doing it from scratch and you're creating your own and crafting your own program, you absolutely want to add that in. But you also want to look for events when you're just attending that have that kind of embedded in it and have that brand strategy in alignment with also a little bit of what your brand is looking for to kind of keep things cohesive in your messaging from a marketing perspective. So it's a great question. I think the answer is very much yes, but it just differs depending on the type of event that you're doing. It could even be like different if you're doing a private event that's unrelated to a particular business objective and maybe more about building community. So there's so many different nuances when it comes to events, as I know that you know very well.
Yeah, I love that example of of like a private dinner and that sense, like the sense of, we call it production value, but that sort of, I'm sure going to struggle for the word, but the sense of fit and finish and that experience is vitally important in that context, the same way that it's for gigantic user conference with 1,000 people, right? Like
Yeah.
that. And I find it very interesting, the idea of aligning your attendance as a strategy to the same kind of level of event that you are trying to eventually get into the stratus for your company. I think that's a great way of seeing it. I think
Yeah.
sometimes event professionals that can be critical and cynical, especially when we are participating in events that we are not producing, because it's just the nature of the business.
Oh,
But
we're
it's an
constantly critiquing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's a producer friend of mine out of New York that every time we go to an industry event, she is very quick to say, "Oh, I would have never done that," and I always have to remind her, "Stop trying to produce the event you're not producing." Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so God love her, she's a wonderful person, but she has that particularity about herself. But I think that's interesting that you put it in the context, if I'm interpreting this correctly, that you go, as you would go to events and you attend events as part of your overall strategy within whatever vertical market you're in. Like, how are you aligning that to where you want your events to go and where you want to be known for? I think that's a very interesting point.
If you don't mind me commenting on that,
Yeah, of
your
course.
brand, whether it's personal, professional, whatever, is an extension of where you kind of also show up physically. So if you're trying to play with the big dogs, people are going to assume you want to be, or maybe perhaps are, a big dog. And it's like, we definitely have very ambitious goals, at least at Traba. And I personally have ambitious goals for myself as well. So I don't want to limit myself. Not to say that the smaller events or the less known events are not impactful. Those are equally as important, especially when they bring the right groups together for more intimate settings that allow you to make kind of deeper connections with the attendees. It absolutely should be cohesive thought process. And maybe something you go to and you're like, actually, it's not quite for us, which we've figured out along the way as well. We'll continue to figure out, or I'm sure people also produce events like your friend said, oh, maybe I would have done this differently, or this, there's always things that you look at critiquing and how you can look for ways to improve.
So events are pivotal in fostering sort of long-term business relationships. Can you describe the strategies that you employ to ensure that your events not only serve that immediate engagement purpose, but also lay some of the groundwork for ongoing relationships?
Yeah. Relationships, in my opinion, are built on a few kind of key factors. Things like trust, communication, respect, kind of a mutual understanding between you and somebody else, acceptance of a person and who they are and maybe what they represent, a level of vulnerability depending on how close you are or how close you want to be. Usually, the more vulnerable you are with somebody kind of allows them to feel more emotion, which therefore allows them to feel more connected to you kind of long term. So that's of how I think about relationships when I'm at events or when I'm representing a business or an organization. kind of at an event. If I'm thinking more on like engagement at an event on the production side, I'm thinking more of what's that unique experience that people can be provided with to make them kind of give them that wow factor. And again, going back to those feelings and the sensories that we all have as humans, those are things that I like to incorporate a lot on the event side, bringing it from the moment they enter maybe a venue all the way through to the after party. And also before that, in the kind of campaign leading up to an event, but basically just focusing on those connections that you make with people, and focusing on the people themselves, and not trying to sell something, but just trying to get to know them, trying to share your, professional experiences, of course, maybe even some of your goals that you have there to make them aware, back and forth, and to continue that discussion outside of a venue, to send them a text message, give them a phone call every now and again. Maybe you saw something that reminded you of them. Tell them, like any other, relationship. You just maybe take it with a little bit of a professional like tone on top, because at the end of the day, you're building like professional relationships. But yeah, just get to know the people and be open to people who are not maybe directly what you're looking for, having something valuable to add to you and your professional career.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. And sort of going on the sort of emotional touch point, can you tell me, let's talk about storytelling and how that can transform an event from, an ordinary sort of gathering into something extraordinary. Do you have a particular approach for weaving narrative elements into events, and how do you tailor those stories to resonate deeply with your audience?
I love storytelling just as a person. I love to read, I love to write. I enjoy, yeah, kind of the beginning, middle, end type thing. I do use a basic structure. If I'm programming for an event, I do use kind of a basic structure of like a book. And maybe like an opening ceremony, for example, could represent like a chapter one type deal. And your middle is kind of all of the substance of the story. Maybe even part of your program includes things like breakouts, which could be designate to particular groups or subsets of groups who are interested in maybe something specific. So you might have an audience that's there for general. For example, we did an event for OpenStreetMap last year, kind of producing it kind of on their behalf, but with TomTom. And everybody's there because they love maps. They love to build maps, and they do it on a volunteer basis. That's what OpenStreetMap does. They go out of their house, they map the things around them, and they put it online for free for people and businesses to use. Guarantee that you, myself, and anybody listening to this podcast has used OpenStreetMap without knowing it, at least their data points. So they're all there to learn about maps. How can we make these maps better? How can we improve? But then we had like subset groups of talk tracks related to different types of map making, things like bicycles or mountaineering map making for road and traffic, all the different like subgroups that can help engage the audience a little bit deeper on the topics that they're more interested in. So storytelling, I definitely tried to weave taking the high level event objectives and like the broader theme of what we want to get out of the event, weaving that into the event through the content, through the programming, but also everything down to like the tiny little napkin that you have underneath a drink. All those little details that people look at and they're like, oh, wow. Or maybe you have something scented that reminds you of something in the industry. Or we did a lot of that at Booking, very, very detail oriented. Incredible events team, incredible event productions there. And you can also bring in like kind of industry experts or keynote speakers to help build on that storyline that are outside of your organization, which can be really impactful for kind of to generate excitement. I worked with one speaker once who I remember very well, now a friend of mine. His name's Jason Caldwell, and we hired him for a couple of Booking events, one in Lithuania, one in the United Kingdom, and I think there was one more, but I don't recall exactly where. And I went with him to these events because I was producing the events. Fantastic speaker. I mean, he's a Guinness World Record holder for rowing the Atlantic Ocean with a couple of other people, like the fastest, it's like 3,000 miles or something, like the fastest record time. Incredible work ethic, very resilient, great at like team building. And our whole event was centered around kind of kicking off the year and high performing culture, because that's really what booking was all about during my time there. And he built his story into our theme to kind of match, talked about his cross of the Namibia desert, first human to ever do it. Incredibly impactful speaker. Everybody absolutely loved him, but got you feeling just a genuine excitement for life. But it really paired well with our idea of high performance culture, building strong teams, building resilient teams, at a time where the company was growing really quickly. So trying to leverage those extra bits that might help add value to your storyline. And then, of course, you need to close the story. You need to end the story. What are your key takeaways you want the audience to know? What's your closing session look like? How do you want your after party or very last thing that they see to feel, or to what do you want them to remember from the event? So basically, just trying to build it like a book, and it's different every time. And I never do it alone. That's important to say. I always work with people, try to collaborate with people who are going to challenge my ideas and tell me, what about this? What about this? That gets me thinking. And then you have, of course, all the vendors and the artists and the production and the AV tech team. And like, you never produce it alone. You produce it with a whole team of people. Yeah. And they're the ones who bring the vision to life.
Yeah, I feel like event professionals sometimes get intimidated by that sort of story crafting or story writing, right? They may see it as a big challenge to almost write a play on for their live event. And really, as you said, it's like what point of the story are we at, right? Like, are we at the beginning of the story, and how does everything sort of integrate into reinforcing the story, which can be as simple as a simple structure of there once was a thing like this that we wanted to change, and we had a challenge, and now we've surmounted it, right? And that's a very, very basic story structure that anybody can use, but a lot of event professionals sort of get intimidated by even starting that journey.
Yeah.
I like the context that you put that in,
And the
and so
starting is the hardest point, in my
mm,
opinion.
yeah,
Like
absolutely.
getting off the ground to the very first bit. Once you get rolling, it gets
Mhm.
easier. And even if your first idea is your worst idea, like just write it down. Just throw something out there and get to kind of generating the idea flow in your own mind and with the people around you, so you can start to talk about it. So you come up with better ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. And so you were talking about integrating, a keynote speaker and put in the context of general thought leadership. How do you identify and collaborate with those thought leaders, and what's been your strategy for blending that thought leadership into those interactive, like that story element of your event?
I mean, I definitely always start with a lot of research. If we're going to hire somebody to, because most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time they are paid, of course, they're doing this for work. So if we're going to hire somebody to be part of an event, I'm usually just honestly behind my desk, researching a lot, surfing the web, looking at TED Talks, looking at who commented on them, searching, speakers in a given area. If we have some limitation with budget, maybe we're not flying somebody in, asking around in my network. I've had a lot of fantastic recommendations. The guy that I just spoke about now, Jason, he was a recommendation. I have no idea who recommended him to me, but he was definitely recommended to me for the events we worked on. And there were numerous other people I hired that were recommended to me. There were also individuals I found just by finding them online, basically, and watching many of these speakers have like videos that you can kind of watch and see how do they look on stage, and kind of gauge whether their kind of aura on stage matches that idea that you're thinking for your event and would fit well in maybe with the culture of your event. So a lot of that. And then in terms of, once, let's say we found somebody or a couple people, whatever, we want to hire them, usually reach out to them a little bit about the event, try and entice them why it's great to be a part of this event, go through a little bit of negotiation on the details of it. And then once they're on board, you can give them a bit more of a brief. And I find oftentimes after I share that brief that three-fourths of the people want to be more involved. How can I tailor my messaging to match this part? Or actually, I think I could instead you ask me about this story, and maybe I tell one that's a little bit different because you're talking about customer service, for example. I had one speaker once, fantastic speaker, John Bazzucco was his name, and he was in the US, and he had a story on customer service for our customer service department. And it was like an eyeglass company that he was talking about. But in the process of getting him to the venue, I was in London, he was in the US, my team in the US, like, was unavailable when he was trying to check into his hotel. This is for booking. So we're an accommodations website. So the hotels we book. And he called me. It was like 11 p.m. for me in London. And he was like, "Hey, Dani, I'm at my hotel. They don't have my reservation." And we had made a mistake on our end, booked like a week later, basically, for his hotel for an event that we're producing on booking.com. The irony was really, really amazing. But then he asked me, can I use the example of what happened last night and how we handled it from a customer service perspective for my talk tomorrow to your customer service department in the event? And I was like, I think that's a great idea. You have to also give a level of trust to the person, and that's just based on your own feeling. What was your experience like with them before? I had never worked with him before, but in this instance, I felt like I really could trust him. And he absolutely knocked it out of the park. I had a lot of people specifically say that his talk was like the most impactful for them at the event. But his whole talk was actually centered around the service he got from an incorrect booking to our customer service department, who deals with that every day. So it was like such a great example that he used of trying to bring the story into the audience even deeper when he had an opportunity to do so. And I think great speakers can identify that, and they can share their opinion with you. And then you can decide as a production team or producer, that's what I want to say, whether or not to kind of go with these changes.
And so finally, when it comes to like feedback, we talked about some ROI metrics. Is there particular metrics that you're looking for post events within the organization or from your audience? And how do you evaluate the success of those events in terms of business outcomes and attendee behavior?
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of specific things you would look for. Probably also starting from the moment you launch the campaign and you announce the event, the engagement rate kind of throughout your like campaign leading up to the attendance rate versus how many people said they were going to come, or if you're in a position where you sold tickets, what's your ROI in terms of the costs that were involved. That event I was mentioning earlier with OpenStreetMap, that was a fully sponsored event. We started with no money. In fact, we started with some debt owed. So it was one of those events where we were like, we have to get sponsors, we have to sell tickets, or we're going to be in debt like tens of thousands of euro. And we did. We came out in a positive way. So you have to, of course, look at like the ROI and are you paying the people and the vendors and everything like that. But also from an engagement perspective, from how people felt at the event, which you can capture a lot, both in the event and post. And then how did it go with your team? Now, in my experience, I've never produced a single event where something did not go wrong. Like, I actually expect for every event I do, something goes wrong. It doesn't have to be something big. There have been large things that have gone wrong at events that I've done, like tech failures or buses showing up super early to a venue and we're not there, or artists just don't show up. That has absolutely happened. But most of the time, it's like more small things that we could have done. Maybe a code or a QR code doesn't work, or the line is not kind of running smoothly for a good experience from an attendee perspective. So you kind of have those qualitative feedback that you're given in real time during the event. And it's important to really note those down and see where can we improve and where is actually just something that, yeah, it is what it is type deal. Like sometimes that happens with food consumption. You don't know how many vegetarians or vegans end up showing up versus how many you expect, and maybe you needed way more chicken than you didn't like than you had. Small things. But looking at the costs involved, looking at the input, your team, the time it took, and kind of seeing what was the return on investment in terms of like captured potential leads, if you're looking for that, in terms of monetary benefit, if you're looking for that, or if it's a fundraising event, and just cross-referencing those two things and seeing, was it actually valuable or was it not? And you can do the same thing in a conference. If you go to a conference and you spend, I don't know, 5,000 to have a couple of people attend, did they make any meaningful connections? Did they have anybody who they they kind of saw 3 months later that actually ended up coming back to us. And they're usually longer term ROIs. You're not really looking at a short cycle here for those types of events. If you have your own production, it can be maybe a little bit shorter because just maybe your company's heavily involved or attending its internal event or something like that. I mean, so many different nuances depending on the type of event you're producing, and a lot of ways to measure the ROI, and you absolutely should do so that you know whether to invest in it again.
So we always like to wrap up these episodes with a practical tip for our listeners. And so I'm going to ask you, if you were to give advice to a event professional coming up in the world or wanting to learn more about weaving storytelling and that sense of a story structure into an event that they're designing or putting together, what sort of practical steps would you give them right from the beginning?
Okay, right from the beginning, you're designing something completely from scratch. I would start by having a little bit of a brainstorming session. I would invite some people that maybe have nothing to do with events just to come with an idea, create a little bit of a structure around your session, and try to basically spitball and get a bunch of ideas. And if you don't have anybody who you feel is very creative, then focus on quantity, and eventually one of those will be also quality. Then take these ideas, run with them, use the tools we now have available. We have so many things available we did not have available in most of my events career. For example, ChatGPT, fantastic tool. Any AI tool is going to break down a structure for you of where you want to start. Whether it's very accurate or not is another question that depends on your prompts, but that's absolutely going to provide a good structure. If you think that you don't have that tool, or if you don't want to use that tool, then take some of the good movies you've watched, or some books you've watched, or some series you've watched. What are some commonalities that link up the stories? How can you translate those same ideas, and not like the ideas from the segments, but really like how they link the story? Where do they drop the cliff off? Do you want a cliff in your event? You can do a cliff in your event. You can have an opening session where you say something at the very end and all the lights drop black. I mean, that's a cliff. Everybody's wondering what the heck's going on, You can have somebody come out on a bunch of drums and just drum it, a drum line. We did that once. Then we had a drummer come from the sky in these little like clear, I don't know what they're called, clear strings where you don't see them, just on a drum. Everybody was not expecting that. Just how can you bring those same concepts you see in entertainment into your event? And of course, you need to make it a professional event. So you need to weave in the parts that are kind of, from a content perspective, the most important and vital that the business wants you to share. And you need to bring your story around those bits and pieces to make it engaging and not just a business update.
Yeah, I love that structure of the get everybody in a room, and I love the quantity strategy versus quality. As you like, not to sort of personify that quantity of cool people in your organization who may or may not be super creative. They're not, quote unquote creative directors, but to get them in the room, because I feel like that's a place where you're going to find those weird ideas of, as you said, somebody suggested like, oh, well, why doesn't he just flying in on a drum? Like it's impractical. Who knows whether or not we can do it? But then, yeah, maybe that's the coolest idea here, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then you can sort of weave that into that story structure, right? And I think one of the things that I really loved about your response is that it's not on that person, right? It is on the organization, and it is on the group, and how do you get that out of a group and get them into a room to collaborate together, rather than what I think a lot of event professionals fear, which is it's me in this little isolated space and I'm going to magically pull this out of my head or something like that. And that's just not the case. We are, this is a collaborative art form that I think that's what attracts people to this industry, is people love to collaborate and love to brainstorm ideas and think outside of the box and all of those buzzwords that I'm going to try to stop using all the time. But that is the essence of it. So thank you very much for that insight. I think that's great advice.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Matthew. I also like to look at a lot of organizations that I follow, brands that are just doing cool shit. I don't know if I can say that. Sorry if I can't.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. Don't
okay.
worry.
It's like
Apple Podcasts is going to take us down.
they're going to take us down. Okay. But follow those brands that you admire or that you see and you're like, wow, what an amazing, after movie. And all these types of things. And what parts of it did you feel really you were inspired by? That I get a lot of my ideas from other people, a lot. I'm creative, but I'm not like, a Houdini or something. Most of my ideas come from friends, family, influencers in the more influencing brands. I guess I follow more brands really than people. Celebrities, artists, musicians, people who just have really random ideas, usually the most memorable. So just utilize all the resources that you have available, because there are so many that you can use and leverage.
Absolutely. So, Dani, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today. If anybody wants to reach out to you, where's the best place to find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn at Dani Daubaras, and I'm also on Instagram at Dani Daubaras. And you can also check out my website, www.danidaubaras.com. Pretty simple to remember if you know how to spell it. It can be difficult. But yeah, feel free to reach out to me, connect with me. I love to meet new people. And if I'm going to an event, you're also attending, send me a message. We can
Yeah,
meet up.
absolutely. Well, thank you again.
Thanks, Matthew.
Production Value Matters, the Business Events Podcast, is brought to you by Byrne Production Services. To learn more about Byrne Production Services and how we can achieve your business goals with meaningful event designs and elevated production value, head over to byrneproductionservices.com. For tailored AV consulting, check out theavadvisor.com, where you can book a free 15-minute consultation. Also, be sure to search for Production Value Matters, the Business Events Podcast, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for listening.